Hi everyone, glad to be here today. My name is Christian Nies. I'm part of the customer architecture engineering team here at Microsoft. And one of the key things me and the team are driving is essentially the work around enterprise scale and the landing zones in Azure. So I'll give you a bit context to what that is. And more specifically, what I want to kind of, extract from the architecture and design methodology that enterprise scale is all about. I want to spend a couple of minutes here today to kind of walk through some of the design principles and the design areas. And the particular design areas we're going to spend time on and do some demos and things like that is the kind of management and monitoring space. So I know that, the audience here has a strong background in System Center, the operation manager, and there could be a couple of things that could be of interest in how some of these things are actually translated into Azure. So let's get started. So first of all, in terms of enterprise scale, what is it, right? As with all other things, there's a background to everything. So what we have learned when we have worked with some of the most complex and most vocal customers of ours going into Azure, we've been really helping them to accelerate and transform not just their the digital estate, but also doing architectural transformation. And one of the patterns, actually 3 of the patterns that we saw with customers that were quite common going into the public cloud was that the lenses they were wearing on-premise did not necessarily translate too well into the public cloud. So all the way from the architecture complexity, how you compose and how you deploy and how you operate application on-prem is not necessarily identical to how you should do it in the public cloud. The second part to call out is the operating compatibility. Again, same tool set, same lenses, same approach were applied into the public cloud world in Azure. And again, just because you could doesn't mean that you necessarily should. So there's a different, approaches you can take to really maximize and leverage and harness the capabilities that the provider basically enables you. And the last one that we see often as well is that there's a lack of trust and desire for control. So instead of leveraging those capabilities coming from the cloud, there was this hesitant to use that. So we see a lot of additional portals, abstraction, shims on top of the cloud provider that basically prevents the application team to transform and also the organization as a whole to accelerate their journey to the cloud. Now, all this, kind of boils down to the same thing. Customers talks about landing zones. And what that really means is what, needs to be in that particular environment of yours for your application to land, whether they are migrated, whether they are net new developed or deployed into the cloud. We all need a landing zone for their workloads. And working with many customers, we have seen, all sort of implementations, right? Because one thing we did not have until this point in time was a prescriptive and authoritative guidance on what does the landing zone means and what does that look like in the context of Azure, right? So we see all singing, dancing front ends, but once we started to pile the onion, we saw that some of the semantics, doing a lot of facilitation was actually not how we would ideally like it to be. So to kind of do a breakdown and baseline the taxonomy a bit on the landing zone, we often use this analogy, and this seems to resonate very well. So you can almost think of a landing zone as a city, right? For you to come into a city, you want to establish an apartment, you want to build a house. There's certain things that needs to be there before you actually can get started, such as water, electricity, gas, and so on and so forth. So if we translate that over to Azure taxonomy, you can think of this as networking, identity and access management, policies, management, and monitoring. It must all be there so that the workloads can actually just, land into the landing zone, and all the things that needs to be true are there. So this leads us basically to the enterprise scale that I'm going to spend some time on. So first and foremost, enterprise scale is all about an architectural and design methodology that basically walks you through 5 design principles that I'm going to talk about briefly across 8 critical design areas. So that basically represent the square at the left-hand side here, representing the enterprise scale architecture. And this is also the authoritative and proven and prescriptive guidance from Microsoft on how to employ Azure, not just Azure at scale, but basically for all customers who want to have a sustainable architecture in Azure. The second part of enterprise scale is the reference implementation. That also means that the things I talk about here today, you can actually go and explore, you can self-service, you can deploy this into your own tenant and basically see the capabilities that this enables out of the box. So we have reference implementation. We have at the moment we have 3 different reference implementation depending on where you start on your journey in Azure. You might have no requirements for hybrid connectivity. You just want to be Azure native. That's one. Or perhaps you have a need for hybrid connectivity in terms of doing large data center migration. So you would either do that using virtual WAN, or you want to use a more traditional hub and spoke. But all these reference implementation, they share the exact same core principles and the attributes, as you will see. So going to the next slide, this is basically the magnitude we're looking at talking about enterprise scale. This is Azure as a whole, taking into account such as enrollment accounts, Azure AD, how you do identity and access management, ideally using privileged identity management, and then all the way down to the management group hierarchy and subscription organization. What are the key things that we recommend that you should go do, and what are the additional considerations for you to think about as you move forward on your journey on Azure? So all of this, composition we're looking at here, when you have that will actually help you to get to a point where you can construct and operationalize the landing zones in Azure. And again, this is where the application will drop. So that was kind of a quick pitch on the enterprise scale itself. Before we kind of dive more into the specific about monitoring, I also want to quickly touch on the design principle, because if you just start to look at a reference implementation, you might, see this as, just a bunch of ARM templates that do some fancy singing and dancing and provision a whole set of things for you to get started. But there's actually a few design principles behind them. So in total, we have 5, and the combination of all these actually enable the autonomy for innovation and transformation, not just for the architecture itself, but also for the application. So there's a level of autonomy that we can provide as part of the platform that actually helps you to get to that sustainable, scalable architecture, regardless of your scale point. The second bullet here is also key, that security and compliance should not be an afterthought. It's actually baked in and by default enabled as part of it. And last but not least, driving that autonomy, really take a dependency that there's governance at scale in place with sustainable cloud engineering. So let's quickly look at those 5 design principles. So one of the key things to call out first is that we really entertain and recommend subscription democratization, right? Subscriptions are the de facto resource container in Azure, and this is what allows you to scale. This is basically just how the platform works today. We see customers try to scale using resource group. Again, a resource group is just a logical container within a subscription, and it's not bound to the throttling and the limits that we have. That's all bound to the actual subscription. Now you might argue and say, hey, if you have a subscription sprawl, there will be cost. They will be hard to manage. It will be hard to operate. And that takes us to the next design principle, which is the policy-driven governance. In Azure today, we have Azure policy that sits natively baked into our front door. So all the requests anyone is making into Azure, whether you're going to create a VM or you're going to, modify a storage account, they're all subject to the same control plane. And this is where we have plugged in Azure policy. So we can look at the request, and depending on the intent of that request, policy can dictate and determine what should happen. We can deny the request, we can append to the request, we can even modify it. But more importantly, we can also deny, and we can use a feature called deploy if not exist. So all in all, the subscription and policy-driven governance enables that autonomy that we also will get back to. The third one is the single control and management plane. And going back to one of the key challenges that I had in the second slide, you saw that there was a lack of trust and desire of control. So customer, in many cases, end up building their own sort of control plane on top of Azure. But what we're saying here is that you should really take a bet on our control plane. We provide you with the identity and access management. We have role-based access control as part of our control plane. We have throttling, we have events, we have loggings. Everything you do is part of our control plane. And as I just spent a few seconds on, we also have Azure policy to ensure we can control all the rule sets that may exist in your environment. So use that to enable a consistent and cohesive experience, regardless whether you are operating the platform or you're one of the application teams who just need to deploy and operate your workloads in Azure. The fourth one is the application-centric and archetype neutral. And this is a bit interesting one because working mostly with customers that come from on-premises, they have typically what we refer to as VM lenses, meaning they see the world through a virtual machine. Now in Azure, a virtual machine for us is just as any other resource, right? So with the philosophy that everything in Azure is just a resource, you should think differently about how you compose, how you deploy, and how you operate your workloads. So that really means that if an application need, for the time being, let's just call it IaaS and also PaaS services, you should not discriminate and you should not distinguish between them from a control, management, monitoring, and security perspective, and allow that flexible resource composition depending on the application requirements. And last but not least, we have an Azure native design and platform roadmap alignment, meaning that the architecture we are providing as part of this really is aligned to the platform roadmap. That's one. The second key thing to highlight is that given that it's aligned with the platform roadmap itself, means that when we introduce new services, new capabilities, whether it's in the networking space or something in the monitoring and management space, the architecture allows you to integrate and consume this as is without having to go back to the drawing board to try to figure out how do we do all this all together again. So those are kind of the 5 critical design principles. Now, as part of the exercise, we also lay down the 5 design principles across the 8 critical design areas. And what we mean by that 8 critical design areas is that all these areas, they really matters in order for a customer to understand what's their North Star architecture and target state in Azure. So to give you an example, if you kind of over-index, let's say on management group and subscription organization, if you have a very fixed mind in terms of what that should look like, the implication of the design decisions you make in that design area will also likely have a rippling impact across all the other design areas. So as you go into the cloud adoption framework to read and learn more about enterprise scale, you can see this constant balance in terms of consideration and recommendation on what you should do across these areas to actually lead the customers and organization to their North Star of Azure. But again, we're not here to listen to me talk about all this enterprise scale stuff. We're actually going to, dive a bit into the management and monitoring space of enterprise scale. And we'll spend some time to kind of go a bit deeper into that particular design areas, our recommendation, do's and don'ts, and we're going to do some singing and dancing demonstration as well. So let's jump straight into it. So what we often see from customers who are employing Azure at scale, and this is just me sharing learnings from customer engagement. Our team is normally looped in when we need to do escalation, we need to do break fix, or we just need to land a particular customer in Azure. So we have seen most of the different compositions and challenges that exist out there today. But specifically when it comes to the management and monitoring space, what we learn from most customers that in the context of Azure and the given architecture and the capabilities and constraints that gives, the net sum is that management and monitoring is often an afterthought, meaning that there are running workloads, there are running components, different resources sitting here and there, and they are not enabled for monitoring. That's one. The second part to call out that tends to be an issue, especially over time, is that there are siloed, converged experience and friction in terms of how do they actually look at the right signals, how do they observe not just the platform that they are responsible for, but all the way through the layer and gate to the actual application itself. So all of this combined leads to friction and really hinder the application teams to get to their North Star state. The third point that I've already double-clicked on a couple of times is that a lot of the stuff we see is VM-centric. So as soon as you come to Azure, you can do a lot of other things than VMs itself. You can go and deploy Kubernetes, you can do web apps, you can do SQL databases, and so on and so forth, which, you know, does not give you a direct access to the actual underlying VM or the underlying host for that matter, right? So the lenses we have already at the entry point needs to be different. And last but not least, even though if you have a VM-centric view, there seems to be no real Azure context, so it really precludes the operating perspective when you know people actually need to go and look at things. And the last part, we also see that, again, goes a bit back to one of the design principles, having a single control and management plane. We see a lot of custom automation that's actually plugged into different subscriptions to go and, you know, hammer pull our platform to understand certain events and then bring things into a compliant monitoring and management state. So how do we actually juxtapose kind of some of those, let's call it anti-patterns, with the recommendation that we provide from an at-scale perspective? So as I already said, everything in Azure is a resource, is a RESTful representation of a resource. So a VM, database, even a subscription, and even the resource groups, they are all resources, right? And common for all these resources is that they all have their own set of properties. So what we're saying here when we say management as code is that Azure also provided declarative language through Azure Resource Manager so that you, whether you're from a platform side, you want to manage the platform and operate it, you can declare what should be the actual specific signals we're going to observe, what should be the alert, what should be the thresholds, and so on and so forth. You can declare that as code inside an ARM template. Right? So that's kind of one. If you look after the Azure platform, we highly encourage you to go and provision the log analytics workspace, configure the alerts, the specific diagnostic settings for the activity log, the security center settings, and so on and so forth, all as declarative code, and treat that as source code and infrastructure as code. And similar for application team, if you have an app, you want to deploy it, you want to enable application insights or other capabilities to turn on the lights, same applies there. You can declare that and deploy that fully as infrastructure as code. The second part we have is that we also have role-based access control. And the way that works in Azure is that RBAC is a deny by default system, meaning if you do not have an RBAC permission at a particular scope, whether it's at the tenant, management group, subscription, or resource group, or even individual resources, you do not have access. So RBAC allows you to form a particular specific segregation of duties where you can then have the platform side looking after the platform side of the things, as well as the application teams, they can look after their stuff without those things bleeding into each other. But at the same time, you also have certain functions very likely in the organization, such as SecOp, that needs to look at things horizontally at scale. So you can also slice and dice and ensure that everyone has the specific permission they need in order to fulfill their function. And last but not least, which will actually be a larger topic for the remaining part of the session, is that we also have Azure policy. And Azure policy, and again, looking at everything being a resource having properties, we have certain gesture that can ensure that no matter how a resource is being deployed, whether it's from the Azure portal, whether it's from a PowerShell script, CLI, ARM template, Terraform, Ansible, you name it, it doesn't matter. Azure policy will be there and bring those resources to its goal state. So we can explore what that actually means from a monitoring perspective as well. Okay, so what does that actually look like? And again, the magnitude here is Azure as a whole, and that's kind of the lenses I want us to be wearing moving forward. So before we start diving deep into the specific tech and how things actually works on the hood, this is just a slide deck to show you the layering cake of Azure, right? So at the very bottom, you can see in Azure, we have what we refer to as resource provider. So each resource provider have one or more resource types, and each resource provider sort of operates on its own, completely independently of other RPs. And that allows us to kind of continue and drive innovation at their own pace, and different teams, they can do their own stuff and ship at their own cadence. So we have resource provider for compute that obviously provides the virtual machine. We have resource provider for networking that gives you virtual network, virtual WAN, virtual hub, Azure firewall, so on and so forth. And then we have for the other services as well. Now, what's common for all these resource providers is that they all has to be part of the resource provider contract, meaning they are subject to the resource provider contract. And that resource provider contract is more or less dictated from Azure Resource Manager. So whenever we're going to ship a new service, we actually need to adhere to that contract so we can ensure that customers, regardless of which client they use, SDKs, how they want to interact with the Azure, they have a consistent experience. So on the top here, you can see this is just some examples of clients that we have out there generated based on the SDKs. They will all be subject to the management endpoint, which is the Azure Resource Manager. So everything they do, if they want to go and start a VM, if they want to add a subnet to a virtual network, when they're going to do a test failover in ASR, they all have to go through this common front door of Azure. And this is where we have this invested largely, where we enable all the capabilities natively in the control plane itself, so the customer get that consistent and cohesive experience using our platform. So what I want to focus on moving forward is basically this part, the policy enforcement, and explain to you a bit how that actually works, and then we're going to switch over to the demo. So coupling some of the design principles we have, such as subscription democratization and policy-driven governance, and what that look like. I have a sort of a presentation here that will do some visual gymnastics. So here we have on the left-hand side, we have a user that has some sort of access to a particular scope in Azure, right? And what we basically have here represent the on front door, right? So they have code in this case, or they're going to use Portal or whatever, and they're going to put that code into Azure. Now, as part of all those requests, they will hit that Azure Resource Manager, which is our control plane. Inside of that control plane, we have the Azure policy. And Azure policy is always on. It's not something anyone can actually disable. It's always there looking after the request, whether you have enabled it or not. So this works on all the create and update requests, meaning HTTP put. It works on change, it works on schedule, and also on demand. So let's have a look at what that actually looks like. So in this case, the user has something they want to create in Azure. Let's, for the lack of better examples, let's say they want to create a storage account, and that storage account does not have HTTP as enabled for communication. So they will submit that request to a front door, and this is where the policy engine will look at the request. If the request is not according to what they have described in their policy, they can deny that request, right? So with that simple gesture, you can ensure that you actually have no opportunity for anyone to do any data exfiltration from that storage account using HTTP in that particular Azure environment. And another example, let's say they go and, okay, they got an error response from the control plane saying that, this particular property was not configured per our guidance. So they go and modify that property and they submit the request again. And this time it will actually bypass, because policy will look at it and say that this is all good. Okay, so this basically continues. So for each and every request that will happen, regardless of who the user is and what permission the users may have, policy will kind of look after all of those things. So eventually you will end up with a lot of resources. And over time, obviously some of the controls may change as well, right? You make changes to policies, new policies comes in, and this is where the policy engine will actually continuously scan the environment, meaning subscriptions, management group, resource groups, and resources, to actually check, hey, based on the policies that are applied now, what's the compliance state for these resources? So you will constantly have that near real-time experience to get the compliance view. And this works across the hierarchy and the structure that you implement in Azure. So all the way from the very top level of the tenant for you to actually go and look at things, you can then ensure that everything is configured according to your compliance requirements. So I think with that, let's move into the demonstration. And for that, I'm going to shift gears and move to the Azure portal. And Harold, if you could confirm that you are still with me and you can see the browser, that would be great.
Yes, I can see it just fine, Christian.
Fantastic. So kind of the starting point, just to show you how all this is tied together and how easily you can get started yourself. We have the enterprise scale GitHub repository, which is where we have the reference implementation. So if you go here and click to deploy to Azure, obviously there's a few steps of prereqs that you need to do, but I will save you for the details now. But once you have done that, you will land on an experience like this, where you actually can go in and configure Azure as a whole in your environment. So what we will ask you for is a region where you will partition, make the deployment to. We will ask for the prefix of the management group. And then we have a couple of questions for you. So already here you can see that if you desire to do so, you can go in and enable log analytics, which is the recommended analytics data store in Azure from an operational perspective. So you can specify the retention days. If you have, retention requirements beyond 2 years, you can also do an export now to storage account or event hub. Then we also ask you to bring in a subscription. And if you scroll down here, for those of you who are familiar with Management Pack, in Log Analytics, we have this thing called Solution, which is basically a set of queries, and that enables that curated experience for you to have an aggregated view across the different log categories that are being gathered, whether it's from VMs or other resources in Azure. So here we allow you to enable those solutions from the get-go. And also from a security perspective, you can enable Security Center on the subscriptions, and you can also deploy and enable Azure Sentinel. So once we have done the configuration of the platform side, we actually get to the point where you can enable the landing zones themselves. So here you can add as many as you want. This will actually move these subscriptions into the landing zone and enable them for all the policies that you look at here. So here you can see that we have a few interesting policies related to monitoring. For instance, we can ensure that Azure VMs, both Windows and Linux, are being monitored. The same for VM scale set, even Azure Arc, which is the off-Azure representation of a virtual machine in Azure. And then we have for AKS and so on and so forth. So with these single gestures, I can now deploy, and obviously I will not do that because that will take like 5 minutes, but I will jump to an environment that I deployed before this demo. So just bear with me while this one is loading. So here's the management group that I provisioned. And here you can see the structure and the architecture we basically have from that perspective. So this is kind of my top level management group. Inside of that management group, I have the platform management group. And this is where we have a subscription. And inside this subscription, this is where we enable all of the platform telemetry and observability that really matters to look after when you're going to operate Azure. So inside of this subscription, we can see that as part of this experience, we got a management group, we got a log analytics workspace, and then we have n number of solutions deployed on top of this workspace. Now I can go in here and I can actually go and I can create my own workbooks. I can go to View Designer and do a custom solution on top of the data. But I can also just go in here and query and start to play around and see what's actually happening in the environment. So what I want to do now is to just give you a glimpse of what's going on in my environment. So I just do a search for all inside this workspace. And it's not that my environment is that large, but we have a few VMs, we have a few subscriptions, we have a few non-compute resources connected to this workspace. So we should actually have quite some data in here. Now, obviously, the query is taking some time here, but as you can see here, we have data from the security baseline. If I also want to kind of do a more let's say, and project all the different types that we have, so you can get an indication of what's the actual categories of logs that we are collecting here. So here you can see there's all sort of different logs and events that we were capturing from a platform perspective. Okay, now the question we then should ask is, okay, how did all these things end up in the workspace in the first place? So to kind of answer that question, let's start to zoom out a bit from this subscription itself. So this was a subscription I enabled for management. I said I wanted to deploy a workspace, and then I had a few questions around what are the certain guardrails I want to have in place. And one of the options I selected was I want to enable resource diagnostics, VM monitoring, and so on and so forth on these resources that I actually are deploying, as also for the new resources that eventually will be deployed over time. So if I go and now look at the subscription and go to the activity log, each subscription has an activity log where you can basically list all the right operations happening in that subscription. So here you can see this user has been doing some deployment, so everything here is tracked, right? But of course, if you have n number of subscriptions, you want to kind of slice and dice and look at this at scale from a central place. So what we actually do as part of that is that we also go and configure the diagnostic settings of the subscription itself. And if I edit the settings, you can see here that all the different log categories from a activity log is selected, and it's actually routed to that workspace I was, just visiting, right? So all the subscriptions by default, they are already monitored and configured for that particular platform workspace as we kind of go along. Now, okay, so this is great. Was this just a ARM template deployment we did as part of the bootstrapping experience to go and enable this? Actually, it's more to it, right? Because this is not a one-off operation. This is something we want for the entire environment. Whether you have 3 subscriptions, you have 50, you have 100, it doesn't matter. We want to ensure that all those subscriptions are actually fully managed and that we collect the important metrics from those subscriptions. So if I go back to management groups, and I'm going to go back to the top and click details, I'm going to click on policies. And in here, and again, this is a demo environment, so don't pay too much attention to the non-compliant part, but in here you can see that we have quite a few policy assignments themselves, right? So the one I was just looking at was the activity log for the subscription. So instead of me, whenever someone goes and create a new subscription, instead of me then reactively going in and enable the diagnostic settings, what I can do is that I can generate this rule and say that, and let's open the definition and have a look at the code. So instead of me going in and specifying the activity log for each subscription, we can now look at this particular policy and see what's happening here. So we have a parameter, we're asking for the log analytics workspace. So when you assign this, you can say, hey, all the activity logs for the subscription, I want it to be routed to this particular workspace. Okay, so if you go down to the policy rule itself, you can see what we are looking at. And this is telling us that if the request coming into Azure contains the field and type, and that type equals subscriptions, then take the following effect, which is deploy if not exist. We're then going to look for, hey, do you have the diagnostic settings enabled? In addition, we're going to check if all the logs are enabled and if the diagnostics settings is routed to the designated workspace. If none of these things are true, that subscription is then categorized as non-compliant, and you need to go and remediate it to bring it into the goal state. Now, in the case when the policy will take effect here and look at this, and a naked subscription comes in, there's no diagnostics enabled for it, it will actually go and provision this ARM template starting from line 80, and what it will do is basically go and put this resource onto the subscription, and then configure all the logs and point it to the workspace ID that's provided as part of the built-in parameter. So again, Instead of me having this repetitive task to go and do this for all the subscriptions that are being created, I just instrument the platform to say that, hey, for all the subscription, I want to enable the diagnostics logs to this workspace, and you are done, regardless of scale point. Okay? The other thing I want to show you is that, let's go and look at the workload itself. So I will go and let's say we're going to find a virtual machine, and I will take, let's see, this one. And let's start from a resource group. Right, so this is a resource group, and the lenses we are wearing right now is I'm an application owner. I deployed something, and I want to build or run my applications on Azure. Now, for the demo purposes, what we have here is actually a virtual machine that's connected to a virtual network. It has a public IP address. We have a network security group, and we have a managed disk. So what I actually did was that I went into the Azure Marketplace. I found a Windows Server 2016. I provided a username and password, and I clicked create. So you can see the create VM here is actually tracked as a deployment inside this resource group. But then you can see quite a few things happen after I deploy the VM. You can see n number of policy deployments here. And again, these are all the policies that exist in my environment that will actually go and not just look after the particular VM, but also the public IP addresses, the network security groups, and so on and so forth. It will look at all those resources and ensure they are compliant. And given the focus here is around management and monitoring, let's have a look at the diagnostic settings for the resources in the resource group now. So again, I just went to the marketplace, and without doing any additional steps, you can see that all these non-compute resources are already enabled for diagnostics. So if I open up the public IP address, you can see that set by policy is there. It's routing all these different logs to that workspace, and we are good. Similarly, if I go back and we then drill into the VM, we also enable this VM for log analytics, right? So we have a policy that look after when the VM is created. If the VM extension with the log analytics agent is not there, policy will come in, enable that so that the VM is wired up correctly. And what that actually gives us an out-of-the-box experience, being an application team, is that I can now navigate to this VM blade in my Azure portal. I can go straight to, let's say, inventory, and I should be able to actually enumerate and list all the inventory that I have as part of this virtual machine, right? So already here, no additional steps needed from my perspective. Further, I can go and explore change tracking, right? What are the different runtime behaviors that are changing inside of the virtual machine, right? So from a Windows perspective, we have the Windows services, we have software, and so on and so forth. And similar, I can look at it from a backup perspective, right? Policy rule says that all new VMs that are being created needs to be associated with a backup vault and have a default baseline backup associated. So here you can see this is already enabled and it's all good. Now, if I dive specifically into monitoring, there's a few options here. As I said, we already connect this to the log analytics, and this is where even though this is a central backup, log analytics workspace, we have an RBAC capability of the workspace to say that, hey, you can either be workspace centric or resource centric. In this particular configuration, the workspace is configured with the resource centric RBAC. So what I can do now is to search for all data and project resource ID. And the only data I will see is data associated to this virtual machine that I have permission to. I will not see any of the neighbors VMs or any other VMs, only the VMs I have access to. So I can use the native KQL capabilities directly from the VM blade to do analytics and forensics and so on and so forth. But again, log analytics provides more than just a raw query language and a bunch of data. We also have curated experience that are built on top of the data that's scattered. So in here we have insights. So out of the box, I can immediately see what's the connectivity landscape for the network interfaces on this particular virtual machine. I can see the VM properties out of the box. I can see all the connections. I can see all the log events categorized as well, and I can see all the changes, okay? And then I can go and see the performance for this VM. So here I can slice and dice, you know, if I want to customize any of this, I can do so as well. And I can even go to the workbooks and select specific workbooks that, you know, either I have customly been building or is provided centrally or is built in as part of the Microsoft workbook. So all of this is, you know, enabled for that virtual machine by default as soon as it deployed into Azure. And the way all this basically is enabled, again, it's not just I don't have to go and do anything manually on the VM. Here you can see all the policies that applies to the particular subscription where this VM got deployed. And here you then see that we have resource diagnostics, we have monitoring for Windows and Linux and all those things that actually makes those things true, okay? So I think the final part of the demo that I want to do is to go back to policy and kind of, you know, examine some of these, and then we're going to look at the monitoring. Actually, I think we're going to look at it from a different angle and say we're going to look at the management, sorry, the platform. So again, going back to the workspace we were actually looking at, right? Workspace, as I said in a few slides ago, recommendation is that you should treat all of this as source code as well. So if you look at the definition for the workspace itself, that's also a policy that will then look at the particular subscription that you bring in for management. And if the workspace does not exist, there's an ARM template that declaratively then will describe and provision the workspace. And what we're doing here is that we are creating the resource group so we can partition the workspace. Also, we are creating an automation account and the workspace. Here you can see we define the retention days and also enable that resource-centric RBAC I was talking about. And then we do a linking of the automation and the workspace itself, because that's actually needed if you want to use update management in Azure. So this is a way for you to centrally, but also allowing the application team to go and patch their VMs natively in Azure using the native tools. So instead of me, you know, having this separated, you know, in its own code base and maintained and deployed manually, I just define it as a rule in my environment. I putting into the appropriate scope where this should apply, and the platform will basically take care of it all. So with that, I will basically conclude this presentation. I'm not sure, Harold, if there's any question I need to address or any other feedback I can help with.
Well, that's a lot of really great information, Christian. Thank you so much for that. Let me just take a quick look at the Q&A. Looks like nothing as of yet, but if anybody has any questions for Christian, please use that Q&A window. And you know, I realize this is very late in the day for some people, perhaps for you as well, Christian, and for others. And it's great that we have a recording of this session as well as the others that we can share with those folks who weren't able to attend this live in person.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Harold.